The morning they divided everything, Rosalind sat at the far end of the dining room table, with her hands folded quietly in her lap, and said nothing at all. The chairs around her were the same ones she had grown up climbing on as a girl, their carved wooden backs worn smooth and pale in the places where decades of hands had gripped them. The curtains were the same heavy green velvet her mother had chosen 30 years ago, still blocking out the October morning light in exactly the manner her mother had liked. The fabric grown thinner now at the very tops where the sun had found it year after year, but still holding its shape, still doing its job with the patient loyalty of good things that outlast the people who chose them. The house smelled the same as it always had, of old wood and lemon polish, and the very faint ghost of pipe smoke from a man who had been dead for 11 years, a smell that had traveled so deep into the plaster and the floorboards and the grain of every wooden surface that no amount of time or opened windows had ever fully driven it out. She had noticed it the moment she stepped through the front door that morning, the way she always noticed it whenever she came back. Her body recognized it before her mind could catch up, the way bodies remember what minds have learned to quietly set aside. Her brother sat across from her with the settled ease of men who have already decided the outcome of a proceeding before it begins. Marcus, the eldest, had driven in from the city the evening before with his wife Celeste, who wore a cream blazer that morning and moved her eyes over the room with the quiet, systematic efficiencies of someone making calculations. Celeste had a gift for assessing the value of things without appearing to, for letting her gaze pass over a room the way a hand passes over fabric, noting texture and quality in a register just below the level of obvious attention. Marcus himself was broad-shouldered and unhurried, his hair going silver at the temples in a way that looked considered rather than accidental, and he carried himself with the ease of a man who had always sat at or near the center of things and had long since stopped noticing that this was a particular position rather than simply where a person stood. Julian, the middle sibling, had arrived that same morning, his car already in the driveway, when Rosalind pulled up just before 9. He had brought a leather portfolio that he kept opening and closing throughout the attorney's reading of the document, a habit she recognized from business meetings he had described over the years, the portfolio functioning as a prop that communicated seriousness and preparation. Both brothers were taller than Rosalind, broader in the shoulders, louder not always with their actual voices, but with the settled gravitational weight of their presence in a room, the unspoken assumption they carried everywhere they went that the room was theirs to occupy, and that other people in it were guests in the space they defined. The attorney was a careful and slightly weary man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled the family's legal affairs for 20 years with the patient professionalism of someone who has watched families at their most human and has learned to offer neither judgment nor comfort, only accuracy. He sat at the head of the table that morning and read from the will document in a voice that maintained exactly the same deliberate pitch regardless of the content of any given sentence, a professional achievement of significant discipline. He read about the investment accounts, then the 2 vehicles. He read about the lake house up in Vermont, which Marcus and Julian had already been trading careful remarks about since the week following the funeral, on their disagreement conducted in the coded and slightly theatrical language of adult siblings who have learned to stop saying plainly what they mean in front of family gatherings. He read about the small but thoughtfully assembled art collection, each piece purchased by their father, with an attention to quality that Rosalind had always found quietly admirable in a man who was otherwise largely indifferent to the idea of decorating the spaces he occupied. He read about the stocks and the retirement accounts and the life insurance policy and the itemized distribution of personal effects. Then he read about the mansion. That was the moment Marcus and Julian had been waiting for, and she could see it in the way their collective attention changed quality as Gerald Fitch moved down the document to that section. the slight sharpening of focus, Marcus's fingers going still on the edge of the table, Julian's portfolio clicking closed with a quiet certainty. The mansion on Haverford Hill had been in the family for 3 generations, which was long enough that it had stopped being merely a property and had become something more like a fact about who the Beaumonts were, the kind of thing that appeared in family stories, the way certain phrases appear in family conversations. Returned to so often, they had worn grooves in the structure of how the family understood itself. Their grandfather had found it in the years just after the war, half neglected and priced to reflect its neglect, and had bought it with the quiet confidence of a man who understood the difference between what something cost and what it was worth, and between the present assessment of a thing and the assessment the future would eventually make. Their father had grown up in it, had inherited it as a young man, had refused every offer made on it in the 4 decades since, with the particular stubbornness of someone for whom a house is not an investment, but a commitment. He had turned down developers and historical preservation societies and wealthy private buyers who wrote elaborate letters explaining how much the property would mean to them, and he had kept it with the loyal stubbornness of a man who believed that some things were not for sale simply because they could be. The mansion sat on 2.5 acres of sloped ground at the edge of a neighborhood that had gone through the full cycle of such places, fashionable in one era, declined in another, and now beginning the slow return that certain neighborhoods make when patient capital begins to notice that what used to be expensive will be expensive again. It had 11 rooms. It had original hardwood floors that creaked in the specific spots you mapped unconsciously as a child and navigated by instinct ever after. It had a carriage house and a garden that had grown somewhat wild in the final years of their father's declining health, the formal flower beds losing their definition to volunteers and the gravel paths blurring at their edges, but wild in the way of something that had a memory of order underneath the overgrowth. The bones of the garden still there if you looked. It appeared in the Historical Society's publications. It had the particular gravity that a house acquires after long enough, the weight of accumulated time that you feel the moment you enter it, as something almost physical, the pressure of all the life that happened inside those walls pressing gently outward. Gerald Fitch explained the distribution with the calm economy of a man who has delivered similar news in similar rooms and knows that the emotional temperature always rises at this point, regardless of what he does. The mansion and the property passed jointly to Marcus and Julian in equal shares, together with the majority of the liquid assets and the Vermont lake house. He read a paragraph about the mechanics of joint ownership and the process for an eventual sale if both parties reached agreement. Then he cleared his throat once, the small formal sound of a man about to read the paragraph that requires the most care. To his daughter, Sir Rosalind Anne Beaumont, he left the deed box and all its contents, as she would understand. Marcus looked up from the table. Just the deed box? Gerald Fitch kept his hands folded on the document. That is what the document states. Julian leaned back in his chair and looked briefly at the ceiling, the gesture of a man recalibrating downward and choosing to perform the recalibration with good grace. Well, he said finally, with the small shrug of someone being generous in front of an audience. He could have at least left her the carriage house. You know, something tangible, a place for her things. Marcus made a sound of mild agreement and looked for a moment at Celeste, who was looking at Rosalind with an expression that was carefully non-committal. Rosalind did not look at either of them. She kept her eyes on the window, on the October light pressing at the gap between the curtains, and she thought about her mother. Not in the large general way of grief, but in the specific involuntary way that grief sometimes finds when you are sitting still and trying hard to keep your face from doing anything. She thought about the exact feeling of her mother's hands braiding her hair when she was very small, the steady, patient rhythm of it, the way her mother hummed without appearing to notice she was doing it, quietly and tuneless, a sound that meant simply that she was present and occupied and close. She thought about the particular tone her mother used calling them all in for dinner from various corners of the house and the yard, a sound that still lived somewhere in the structure of this building even now, went embedded in the plaster alongside the pipe smoke and the lemon polish, the ghost of a voice that had once filled these rooms. She was thinking about small, specific things because the large ones were too heavy to lift all at once in a room full of people watching her face. She did not cry. She had made herself that promise in the car on the way over, and she kept her promises, which was one of the things her father mentioned in the letter, though she did not know that yet. Marcus and Julian celebrated in the quiet way of men who have received exactly what they anticipated and feel a brief flutter of something uncomfortable at how easily it arrived. By the time Gerald Fitch had gathered his papers and the coffee had gone cool on the sideboard, that brief flutter had been resolved into forward motion. Marcus walked the ground floor with his hands in his pockets, pausing in doorways, looking at ceiling molding and window frames, and the place under the stairs where the wood had always been slightly soft. He moved through the rooms the way a new owner moves through them, rather than the way a child of the house moves through them, assessing rather than remembering. Julian stepped into the back hallway and called his financial advisor, his voice carrying that particular drop in register that men use when they are conducting actual business rather than merely discussing it. Celeste stood in the kitchen and began describing the renovation with confident specificity, a notebook appearing from her bag, measurements being made, on decisions being reached in real time by a woman who had clearly been thinking about this kitchen for considerably longer than this morning. Rosalind went to the study and found the deed box on the shelf behind the leather-bound books. It was not large, made of dark mahogany, roughly the size of a shoebox, but considerably heavier, with brass fittings that had oxidized to a pale green and a small keyhole set into the face. She had seen it her entire life, on that shelf in that study, and had never once thought about it in any particular way. It was simply one of the dozens of objects in the house that had always been there and had therefore ceased to be objects she actually saw, folded instead into the permanent background that familiar rooms become over years. She carried it out to her car by herself. Nobody offered. Nobody seemed to notice her leaving. The car was 12 years old and had a dent in the rear quarter panel she had been telling herself she would get fixed for 2 years. She put the deed box on the back seat and buckled it in with the seatbelt, a gesture so instinctive she didn't register it until it was done. And then she sat in the front seat with her hands on the wheel and looked at the mansion through the windshield for a long, quiet moment. She had grown up in that house. She had learned to read in the room at the top of the stairs that caught the afternoon light. Sitting in the window seat her father had built directly into the wall when she was 6, because she kept climbing up into the sill to look down at the garden, and he had decided the problem required engineering rather than prohibition. She had broken her wrist at 9 falling from the oak tree in the garden, misjudging a branch with the pure confidence of a child who has not yet learned the specific ways gravity will eventually correct her. Her father had carried her to the car with the steady, unhurried calm she had always associated with him, his voice making the situation into a problem with a practical solution rather than a crisis requiring alarm, which was the way he handled most things. She had come back to this house after her divorce 20 years ago, slept in her old childhood bed for 3 months, her father making no comment and asking no questions, and producing coffee every morning, the way he always had, strong and slightly bitter, the coffee of a man who assumed the person drinking it was capable of handling their beverage without softening. The road blurred slightly on the drive home, and she blinked it clear before she reached the highway. Her apartment was above a dry cleaner's, in a part of the city where the houses were closer together and the trees were younger. Streets laid out in a later era by people with different ambitions. 6 years she had lived there, long enough that the background chemical smell from the dry cleaners had entirely stopped registering in her mind as anything at all. 2 bedrooms, the second one converted to an office, a kitchen small enough that organization was not optional. She worked as a bookkeeper for 3 small businesses that required her to be precise and reliable and thorough, and qualities she had always possessed and had learned after the divorce to think of as assets, rather than the boring personal attributes she had dismissed them as in her 20s. She put the deed box on the kitchen table and made tea before she opened it. This was not procrastination. It was the same impulse that had led her father to build a window seat instead of issuing a prohibition. The recognition that some things were better approached with proper preparation. She had found a small key on her father's keyring after the funeral, plain brass, nothing remarkable about it, sitting among the house keys and car keys and the several orphaned mystery keys that accumulate on a person's ring over the course of decades and are kept because discarding them feels like declaring the mystery permanently unsolvable. And she had kept this particular key separate from the others in the pocket of her coat, moved there by some instinct that had not announced its reasoning. She fit it now into the deed box keyhole and felt the mechanism give with the precise, smooth click of a lock made to last. Inside, green felt, faded lighter at the edges. Several papers folded in thirds, and then thirds again. The creases pressed sharp and permanent by decades of lying folded in the dark. 2 photographs, one of her grandparents on their wedding day, formal and slightly stiff in the manner of photographs from that era, her grandmother's expression containing what might have been amusement, held carefully in check, and one of a building she did not recognize, photographed in summer, the light flat and direct, the structure plain and without obvious distinction, while a survey map folded separately, a small envelope with her name on it in her father's handwriting, the letters somewhat larger and less precise than they had been in his earlier years, changed by the slight tremor that had come to his hands in the final decade of his life. She opened the envelope last, as he had probably intended. 3 pages, handwritten in his voice, which was measured and economical, and delivered information in the smallest number of words the information required, which was not a coldness, but a form of respect, the assumption that the person reading was capable of understanding without being guided to understanding. But underneath the measured economy of the sentences, there was something she felt in the spaces between them, while care communicated not by the warmth of the language, but by the extraordinary fact that he had spent this much time on this, had written and presumably rewritten these 3 pages with the trembling hands of an old man who believed she needed to know what he was about to tell her. He was sorry for the manner of things, he wrote. He had considered other ways, and believed this was the only one that would accomplish what he intended. He wrote about her grandfather and the 14 acres the old man had bought in 1947, when the ground was cheap and the county was still being shaped into what it would eventually become, bought with the patient forward vision of someone who understood that the present moment's assessment of value was not necessarily the future's. And he wrote about what he himself had come to understand about that land over the last years of his life, about the municipal documents he had found and read carefully, about what they described and what they implied. He wrote that he had chosen to say nothing to her brothers. He had chosen her, he wrote, not because he loved her more, he was explicit and careful about that, but because she was the one who paid attention. He wrote that the mansion on Haverford Hill was not the inheritance. The deed box was the inheritance. And the distinction mattered more than she could yet understand. But he believed she would understand it. She read that sentence 3 times before she moved on. Then she went back to the documents with the particular focused attention of a person who now knows they are looking for something specific, which is a different and more useful state than simply looking. The first deed described a parcel of land in the formal language of 1947, cardinal directions and precise measurements and references to landmarks long since absorbed into changed geography. The second document was older, with the slight waviness of paper stored in less than ideal conditions over many decades, the text still legible, but requiring patience. The third was a surveyor's map, covered in careful lines and exact measurements, notations in the margin. In a professional hand she did not recognize. She was at the kitchen table until after 2 a.m. Second cup of tea. Third. The apartment's nighttime sounds arranged themselves around her. The refrigerator, a car on the wet street below, the ventilation system from the dry cleaners doing something it did only when the temperature outside dropped past a certain point. She read the documents through twice, and then through again, looked at the photographs under the kitchen light, studied the survey map until she had its main features memorized. By midnight, she understood that she needed professional help. By 1, she understood that the kind of help she needed had to be chosen with care, that the wrong conversation at the wrong moment could expose something that was not yet ready to be exposed. By 2, she locked the box and sat for a while with her empty mug in both hands, not looking at anything in particular. Her father had written that what appeared to be nothing was in fact everything. She was beginning to understand what he meant by that. She was beginning to understand what kind of man spent years studying a municipal planning document and said nothing to anyone and arranged the contents of a deed box in a particular order and wrote 3 careful pages to a daughter he trusted to pay attention. She was beginning to understand how long he had been waiting for her to open that box. The property lawyer named Diana Crane came recommended by a friend who described her as formidably thorough and somewhat frightening, and these were precisely the qualities that the situation required. Diana's office was on the 3rd floor of a downtown building, spare and organized in the manner of a workspace where time was the primary resource, and wasting it was the primary offense. Her desk was clear except for what was immediately in use. She read what Rosalind brought her with the focused attention of someone operating within her area of mastery. No reaction, no drama, only the efficient intake of information. She asked twice for specific dates confirmed. Once for a name that appeared in both the 1947 deed and the survey. Then she sat back and spent more time with the survey than with everything else combined. "This parcel," she said. "What is its current county classification?" Rosalind had prepared. Undeveloped land. Agricultural classification for tax assessment purposes, unchanged for decades. 14 acres. Diana turned to her laptop and ran 3 searches with the decisive speed of someone who knows exactly where she is going. Then she looked at the screen with the particular stillness of a person processing something that has exceeded what she anticipated. "How long has this deed been continuously in your family's name?" "Since 1947. My grandfather purchased it outright. It passed to my father in 1978, and from my father to me under the terms of his will." Diana turned the laptop slightly. A planning overlay map appeared, the kind that shows active municipal studies and infrastructure proposals in their preliminary stages, visible to those who knew what they were looking at and effectively invisible to those who did not. The boundaries of the 14-acre parcel were visible in the mapping view, matching the 1947 survey exactly. Around the parcel, in the careful notational language of official preliminary planning documents, were markings that Rosalind had seen in her own research and had not known how to fully read. "Your father was right," Diana Crane said, and something in her professional voice shifted almost imperceptibly, the neutral surface giving way briefly to something that was closer to genuine surprise than she probably intended to show. This land is not agricultural, not in any meaningful current sense. Rosalind said, "What is it?" Diana set her glasses on the desk. There is a proposed transit corridor. Active planning for approximately 4 years at the state level. Still technically in preliminary phases. Not yet publicly announced. But the environmental studies are in their final stages. She pointed to the screen. The route runs directly through this region. Your parcel sits in the center of the projected acquisition zone. When this project moves from preliminary to approved, and everything available to me suggests that the move is imminent, the state will need to acquire your land. And the pricing for land that a state transit project requires and has no alternative route around is calculated very differently than agricultural land pricing. How differently? Diana leaned back and looked at her steadily. Several orders of magnitude. The words arrived in the spare organized office and settled there without drama. Rosalind looked at the screen, at the red outlined shape of 14 acres of land she had never visited, had never thought about, had assumed, if she had assumed anything at all, was simply an old piece of paper in a box of old papers. The kind of thing a family accumulates over generations and files away and mostly forgets. She thought about the deed box on the shelf in her father's study, sitting behind the unread books, the brass fittings going green, patient as the man who had put it there. She thought about Marcus at the table, his fingers stilling, just the deed box, the quick recovery, the easy confidence reasserting itself before the sentence was finished. She thought about Julian's magnanimous shrug, the comment about sentiment, the leather portfolio clicking shut on its practical certainty. She thought about Celeste in the kitchen with the notebook, measuring what was already hers in her mind. She thought about 3 pages written in a slightly unsteady hand by a man who had understood, years ago, what none of them had bothered to look for. "What do I do?" she said. Diana picked up her pen. "First, you do nothing that creates visibility around this parcel. No conversations, no inquiries, nothing that draws attention to your ownership before we're ready. Second, you let me verify the complete ownership chain formally and confirm the deed is clean and uncontested. Third, you wait." She looked at her directly. The public announcement is probably 6 to 8 months away. When it comes, values along the corridor route shift immediately. Your position needs to be fully established and documented before that moment. Rosalind thought about the years above the dry cleaners, the small, careful life she had built with her precise and unremarked attention. The 3 businesses whose books she kept with the thoroughness of someone who understands that the small errors add up to the large ones, if nobody is watching. "Yes," she said. "I can wait." She gathered the documents and returned them to the deed box in the order her father had arranged them, closed the brass fittings, and held the box for a moment before putting it back in her bag. "Your father was a very careful man," Diana said. "He was." He thought about this for a long time. "Yes," Rosalind said, pausing at the door. "I'm only beginning to understand how long." She drove home through the ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the deed box on the passenger seat, the world moving past the windows in its ordinary way. And she thought about her father in his study with the box on the shelf, the key on his key ring with the other keys, the Sunday evening phone call she had made to him every week without fail for 15 years, and the pauses that had come at the end of those calls in the final year of his life. The moments when he seemed on the verge of saying something more, and then chose not to. And she had assumed it was simply the reluctance of an old man to end a conversation. She understood now what it had actually been. He had been deciding. He had been holding something in careful silence and deciding when the time was right and who the right person was. He had decided on her. She pulled into her parking spot below the apartment and sat for a moment looking at the building. Then she took the deed box inside, put it on the highest shelf of the closet behind the tax files, made dinner, washed the dishes, and sat down at her desk to address a discrepancy in the dry goods importer's accounts, payable that she had been meaning to resolve all week. She found it in 11 minutes, a transposed digit in a reconciliation column, the kind of small error that compounds quietly into larger confusion if nobody is paying the kind of attention that finds it. She corrected it, documented the correction, sent the updated file with a brief explanatory note, and closed the laptop. Then she went to bed. She was the one who paid attention. Her father had been right about that. Thank you so much for staying with us through part 1 of this story. What Rosalind discovers when she finally walks that land for the first time, and the moment her brothers understand what their father truly knew and truly left behind, is all coming in part 2. Stay subscribed, and do not go anywhere. We will pick up right where we left off. The months that followed were the strangest of Rosalind's life, not because anything dramatic was happening in any visible sense, but because the largest thing that had ever happened to her was unfolding in total silence, a silence she was responsible for maintaining, and which sometimes pressed against her with a weight she had not anticipated. She went to work. She drove to the restaurant on 5th and spent Tuesday mornings going through the week's accounts with the calm, systematic focus she always brought to it, finding the small errors before they became large ones, reconciling figures that other people's inattention had allowed to drift. She drove to the dry goods importer on Clement on Thursday afternoons and sat in the back office with the month's invoices and the running totals and the perpetual question of what had been shipped versus what had been received versus what had been paid for, are 3 numbers that should always agree and rarely did on the first pass. She spent Friday mornings at the accounting firm, which still struck her as quietly funny. An accounting firm hiring a bookkeeper to manage their own internal accounts, the cobbler's children needing shoes. She cooked her meals and ate them at the kitchen table and called nobody about the deed box. She tended the balcony garden through the last warmth of autumn, cutting back the summer annuals, protecting what could be protected, letting go of what couldn't be, which was a form of discipline she had always found the garden useful for teaching. She mulched the containers and noted what she would plant differently next year and went back inside and made tea. Marcus called her twice during those months. The first time was in November, his voice carrying the particular ease of a man who has recently consolidated a significant asset and is feeling generous because of it. He told her they had decided to list the mansion after the first of the year, when the market typically showed more activity, that the numbers were favorable, that he hoped she understood it was a practical decision and not a sentimental one. She said she understood. She did not say anything else that required answering. He seemed mildly relieved by her tone, the way people are relieved when they have been prepared for more resistance than they encounter, and the call ended warmly. The second call came in late December. He needed to know if she had any of their father's personal effects that she didn't intend to keep, since they were clearing the study for the staging. She said she had what she needed. He did not ask about the deed box. He did not ask what specifically she had taken from the study. She understood that in his mind, the deed box was a negligible item, the kind of thing a man with sentimental attachments might leave to a daughter who would appreciate the gesture, the kind of thing that contained old letters and family photographs, and perhaps a small amount of cash that had been put away and forgotten. The kind of thing you note and mentally set aside, because its apparent smallness makes it categorically unimportant, which was precisely what her father had counted on. Julian sent a photograph in December, a before and after of the renovated kitchen. The marble was pale and very clean. The pendant lighting was modern and carefully chosen. The lemon polish and old wood smell did not come through in the photograph, which was fortunate because it was no longer there. The message attached said, "Amazing what a little investment can do." She looked at the after image for a while at the white marble where the old wood had been, and she thought about her mother in that kitchen at various ages, and she put the phone down without replying. She saw Diana Crane once a month, brief professional meetings in the spare office with the well-organized shelves. Diana confirmed in January that the deed was clean, the ownership chain unbroken and clearly documented, her grandfather's original purchase in 1947, flowing in a straight documented line to her father, and then to her. No gaps, no ambiguities, no competing claims that had been filed or could easily be constructed. The transit corridor studies were proceeding on the schedule Diana's contacts in the planning world had allowed her to estimate. The environmental clearance was expected before spring ended. The strategy remained exactly what it had been in October. Wait, say nothing. Let the documentation accumulate its quiet strength. February brought a single update. The transit corridor project had moved from purely internal planning to the preliminary public record phase, not yet announced to the general public, but now visible in county and state filing systems to anyone who knew precisely what to search for and why. Diana had been searching. The corridor ran exactly as projected, matching everything the planning documents had suggested. Diana had filed the formal paperwork establishing Rosalind's ownership with the county, a routine and unremarkable in the way that precisely correct legal actions are unremarkable when they are executed without fanfare. March brought the public announcement on a Tuesday morning, and the world changed the way it always does when something that has been known in private becomes known in general, all at once, and with the particular energy of information arriving in a system that is not yet organized to receive it. By Wednesday, Diana's phone had begun to ring with calls from people who were suddenly very interested in the parcels along the corridor's projected route. By Thursday, 2 separate development firms had sent preliminary letters of interest to addresses they had pulled from county records. One of those letters came directly to Diana's office, as addressed to the owner of record of a 14-acre undeveloped parcel in the acquisition zone. Diana forwarded it to Rosalind with a single line of accompanying commentary. "The announcement has been made. You may wish to see this." Rosalind read it at her kitchen table with her first cup of coffee, sitting in the same chair where she had sat 5 months ago with the deed box in front of her and her father's letter in her hands, and the specific quality of a person who does not yet know what they are holding. The letter used the careful aspirational language of firms that want very much to acquire something they have not yet been able to price, full of phrases about fair market value and community development and partnership and their particular expertise in situations exactly like this one. She put it down and looked at the balcony garden. The early spring planting had begun to show the first small evidence of green, things pushing through soil she had turned and amended on a warm afternoon the week before, the beginning of something. Her phone buzzed with a news alert, a local outlet covering the transit announcement. She read the article, which described the corridor's projected route and mentioned the land in the acquisition zone in language that called it largely undeveloped agricultural property of modest assessed value. Modest assessed value. She almost said it aloud, the small private irony of it. She called Diana instead. Diana answered on the second ring. 2 more letters this morning, she said, without preamble, and a call from the state's acquisition office requesting a preliminary meeting to discuss the parcel. What are we looking at in terms of numbers? Diana was quiet for a moment, the particular quality of quiet she used when she was preparing to deliver a significant figure and wanted to deliver it accurately rather than approximately. Then she said the number. Rosalind set her coffee cup down on the table with a careful and deliberate motion. She said, "Can you say that again, please?" Diana said it again. The figure was not agricultural. It was not the figure that a county tax assessment produced when it looked at 14 acres of land that had been sitting undeveloped and reclassified as modest farmland for 7 decades. It was the figure produced by the intersection of a specific parcel's location with the immovable requirement of a major state infrastructure project that had spent 4 years of environmental study and planning, arriving at a corridor it could not alter. It was the premium attached to necessity when necessity has no alternative. It was several orders of magnitude from the assessed value on the county records. It was enough to change the arithmetic of a person's entire life in a single conversation on a Tuesday morning in March. "We are in an excellent position," Diana said, with the measured understatement of someone whose version of excitement is the controlled precision of a person saying exactly what is true. Rosalind put her hand flat on the surface of the kitchen table, the second-hand table she had bought for $60 8 years ago at an estate sale, and felt the grain of the wood under her palm. So she thought about the apartment above the dry cleaners and the 12-year-old Subaru in the parking lot outside, and the 3 sets of accounts she kept with meticulous and unremarked care week after week. She thought about her father in his study with the deed box behind him on the shelf, the key on his key ring among the ordinary keys, the Sunday evening phone calls that had been the fixed point of her week for 15 years, and the pauses at the end of those calls in the final year that she had interpreted as reluctance to hang up, and now understood as something else entirely. He had been carrying this knowledge for years. He had been sitting with it quietly in the study, with the leather-bound books and the pipe smoke absorbed into the walls and the deed box on the shelf, and he had decided who would understand what it meant, and he had decided it was her. She thought about Marcus and Julian at the table, the leather portfolio, the cream blazer, the magnanimous shrug, the easy confidence of men dividing up what was obviously valuable, while the thing that was not obviously valuable sat in its box on a shelf and waited. She thought about what her father had written. What appeared to be nothing was in fact everything. She said, "Let's schedule the meeting with the state acquisition office." Diana said, "I'll call them this morning." Rosalind sat for another moment at the kitchen table, with the morning light coming through the window and the early spring garden showing its first small green evidence on the balcony outside, and the letter from the development firm sitting on the table in front of her, with its carefully aspirational language about fair market value and partnership and their particular expertise. Then she got up, rinsed her coffee cup, and went to the desk in the back bedroom to open the restaurant's accounts for the week. She had work to do. She always had work to do, and she had always done it well. Thank you so much for staying with us through part 1. What Rosalind discovers when she visits that land for the very first time, and the moment her brothers realize what they missed and what their father truly left behind, is all coming in part 2. Stay subscribed and we will see you there. She was at her desk when Marcus called again, 9 days after the transit announcement. She had been expecting the call, not with anxiety, but with the calm recognition of someone who understands that certain conversations are inevitable and has simply been waiting for the moment of their arrival. She was going through a quarterly reconciliation for the dry goods importer when the phone lit up with his name, and she looked at it for a single ring before answering. "Marcus," she said. He skipped past the pleasantries with an unusual directness that told her he had been thinking about this call for some time and did not want to lose the thread of his argument before he reached it. He said he had seen the transit announcement in the news, and that Julian had flagged it as a potential investment opportunity, and they had been looking at the parcels along the corridor, just exploratory, just research, and he had come across something in the county records that had surprised him. He had found her name, attached to a 14-acre parcel directly in the acquisition zone. There was a pause on the line, a pause that contained several simultaneous recalculations. "Is that one of Dad's old properties?" he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who is asking a question he already knows the answer to, but needs to hear confirmed before he can accept it. "It's mine now," she said. He left it to me. The pause this time was longer. She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and she could hear in the breathing the specific effort of a man rearranging a mental picture that he had assumed was fixed. "Rosalind," he said, and his voice had changed to something more careful. The easy, settled confidence replaced with a register she did not often hear from him, something that was working at being neutral and not entirely succeeding. "That land, the corridor acquisition, do you understand what it's worth right now?" "I do," she said. She kept her voice exactly as it always was, quiet and clear and steady. The voice of a woman who has been paying attention and is not surprised by what the attention found. He said, "We should talk about this. As a family, the family should be part of a decision this significant." She said, of course. She meant it genuinely. She was not angry at her brothers, or if she was, the anger was the clean kind that does not need to raise its voice, because it is already standing on ground that will not move. She said, "I'll call you at the end of the week. We can have a proper conversation then." She hung up and sat for a moment at her desk, the phone in her hand, looking at the reconciliation spreadsheet still open on the laptop. She thought about the years of Sunday phone calls to their father, the careful love of a man who expressed himself through action rather than declaration, through the slow, patient work of putting things in order so that the right people would find them at the right time. She thought about 3 pages, written in a slightly unsteady hand, by a man who had decided she was the one who would understand. He had been right. She put the phone down and returned to the reconciliation. She found the discrepancy she had been working toward in another 20 minutes, a misclassified expense that had been pulling the quarterly total $300 off from what the receipt supported. She corrected it, updated the file, sent it with a brief note explaining what she had found and how she had resolved it. Then she closed the laptop and made dinner and washed the dishes and sat for a while on the balcony with her tea, looking at the early spring planting and thinking about 14 acres of land she had not yet visited. Land that had been sitting in a deed box on a shelf for years, while the world around it slowly decided what it was worth. She would visit it soon, and she wanted to see what her grandfather had seen in 1947 when he looked at that ground and understood something about the future that the present had not yet caught up to. She wanted to stand on it. It was hers. The land was harder to find than she expected. She had the address from the survey, a rural route number, and a section description that made perfect sense on a map, and considerably less sense on an actual road on a Thursday morning in late March, with the sky the color of old pewter, and the GPS on her phone insisting she had arrived at a destination that appeared to be a gravel turnout between 2 overgrown drainage ditches. She pulled the Subaru to the side and looked out through the windshield at what was there, which was a low wire fence, a wooden post that had been there long enough to develop its own moss colony. And beyond the fence, a field that was not dramatic in any way, not beautiful in the postcard sense, not distinguished by any feature that would cause a person passing it on the road to slow down and look. She sat in the car for a moment with the engine running and the heat on against the March chill, and she looked at the 14 acres that were hers. The land was low and relatively flat, rising gently toward a tree line at the far edge that was a mix of second-growth hardwoods, bare still at this time of year, their gray branches making a complicated pattern against the gray sky. The near portion of the field had been hay at some point, the previous season's growth still lying matted and pale in uneven windrows where it had fallen and not been collected. There was a section toward the center that was lower than the surrounding ground, a shallow depression that would collect water in the wet season, and she could see the remnants of an old stone wall running roughly east to west across the middle distance. The stones tumbled and scattered in the way of walls that have been left to manage themselves for a generation or two. Along the western edge, parallel to the road, a line of old maples stood at intervals that were too regular to be accidental, the kind of planting a farmer had done a century ago to mark a property line with something that would outlast both the farmer and the fence. None of it was what anyone would look at and see fortune. That was the thing she kept coming back to as she opened the car door and walked to the wire fence and stood there in the cold, March air, looking at her grandfather's 14 acres. None of it announced itself. None of it wore its significance on its surface. It looked exactly like what the county tax record said it was: undeveloped land of modest value, unremarkable in its particulars, the kind of ground that gets passed over by people in a hurry, because people in a hurry look at surfaces and move on. Her grandfather had not been in a hurry. She did not climb the fence. She was not ready to walk the land yet, not until she had stood at its edge long enough to feel whatever it was she had come here to feel. She had not been sure why she needed to visit before the acquisition meeting, had not fully articulated it to herself on the drive out. But standing here with the cold air against her face, she understood. She needed to see it. She needed to make it real in the specific physical way that only standing somewhere makes a place real. It had existed for months as a set of documents, as a number on a screen in Diana Crane's office, as the subject of a phone call from a brother who had finally started paying a different kind of attention. It needed to also be this: a field, a tree line, a row of old maples, a stone wall going quietly back to the earth. She stood there for a long time. She thought about her grandfather, a man she had known only as an old man in the last years of his life, substantial and deliberate in the way of people who have built something and know the weight of what they carry. She thought about him coming to this road in 1947, a young man then, still assembling the life he would eventually hand down, looking at this unremarkable field and seeing something in it that had nothing to do with what it was at that moment, and everything to do with what the county around it was going to become. She did not know exactly what he had seen. The letter had told her some of it, the shape of the roads being planned, the way the county was beginning to think about its own growth, the particular geography of this parcel in relation to routes that would eventually matter. But there was something beyond the practical analysis that she imagined he must have felt, standing here in an earlier version of this same gray March air, some instinct that came from paying a certain kind of attention to the world and trusting what that attention told you. She had that instinct too. It was, her father had said, one of the things they shared. She drove back to the city with the heat on and the radio off, thinking about old maples planted in rows and stone walls going back to the earth, and 14 acres that looked like nothing and were in fact everything. The acquisition meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in the state office building downtown, the kind of building that communicates the confidence of institutions through its architecture alone, wide steps and stone surfaces, and the particular interior smell of carpet cleaned on a regular schedule under fluorescent lights. Rosalind arrived with Diana Crane, who carried her document case with the focused calm of someone who had prepared for every plausible version of this conversation and a few implausible ones as well. Diana wore the expression she reserved for professional encounters, which was not quite neutral and not quite formidable, but managed somehow to be both at once, the face of a person who has done the work and is not worried about how the meeting will go. The room they were shown to was larger than the meeting required, a long table with enough chairs for a conference of 12, occupied by 4 people, 2 on each side. On the state side sat a project director named Howard, who had the practiced affability of someone whose job regularly required him to negotiate the acquisition of things people did not want to sell, and a woman named Patricia, who appeared to be the legal representation, and who had the particular alertness of someone trained to listen for the precise word that changes the meaning of a sentence. There was a third person, the senior acquisition coordinator, whose name Rosalind heard and immediately did not retain, which was not unusual for her in these kinds of settings. Howard opened with an explanation of the transit corridor project's timeline that assumed Rosalind might not have read the public announcement carefully, and then moved to the acquisition process, and then arrived at what he framed as the state's commitment to fair and efficient resolution for all landowners along the route. His tone throughout was the tone of a man who respects you enough to be pleasant, while also holding a position he has no intention of abandoning quickly. Diana Crane said, "We're prepared to discuss fair market valuation. We have an independent assessment," Patricia said, "as does the state." Diana said, "I would be surprised if they matched." There was a brief silence in which everyone at the table acknowledged, without saying it, that they would not. Howard presented the state's initial figure. It was a significant number by any ordinary standard, the kind of number that rearranges a person's practical possibilities in substantial ways. He presented it with the air of someone making a reasonable opening offer, which it was, reasonable in the way that opening offers in negotiations are reasonable, which is to say, it was the number at which you begin, not the number at which you end. Diana listened to the figure without reacting, which was itself a form of communication, and then said, "Our assessment is considerably higher." Howard said, "By how much exactly?" Diana opened the document case and named a number. Then she placed on the table, with the quiet precision of someone laying down a hand they are not concerned about, a bound document that was their independent assessment, prepared by a firm with credentials Howard clearly recognized, with methodology that Patricia immediately began reading with the focused attention of someone looking for a vulnerability and not yet finding one. "You understand," Howard said after a moment, "that the state has established parameters for corridor acquisitions of this classification." Diana said, "I understand that the state has a project that requires this specific parcel, that the environmental clearance is complete, that the timeline cannot be extended without significant cost to the corridor's overall schedule, and that my client's ownership is clean and uncontested." She paused for exactly the length of time required to let those facts arrange themselves in the room. "I also understand that the state's interest in a prolonged negotiation is limited. Our assessment reflects the parcel's value in the context of what the project requires it for, not in the context of a tax classification that has not been updated in decades." Patricia said, "We'll need time to review your methodology." "Of course," Diana said. "We've anticipated that." She distributed copies of the assessment documentation to each person at the table, with the efficient economy of someone who has been preparing for this meeting for months, which she had. The meeting ended without a final number, which was the expected outcome, and not a disappointment. It ended with a follow-up meeting scheduled for 3 weeks hence, and it ended with a specific quality of silence from Howard and Patricia that Rosalind had learned, over the months of working with Diana, to read accurately. It was the silence of people who had expected a weaker position on the other side of the table and were recalibrating. Outside on the wide stone steps, Diana said, "They'll come up. How far?" Diana considered. "Far enough. The methodology is sound and they know it. Patricia saw it in the first 5 minutes. They'll need internal authorization to move from their opening position, which will take 2 to 3 weeks, which is why the follow-up is in 3 weeks." She looked at Rosalind evenly. "This is going the right way." Rosalind nodded. She was looking at the street, at the ordinary Thursday morning moving past the building, on people with places to go and things to carry, and the 1,000 private urgencies that make up a city in motion. She thought about her grandfather standing at the edge of a field in 1947, with whatever he had in his pockets and whatever he had in his mind, seeing something in a piece of ground that nobody else had paused long enough to see. She thought about her father at his desk, reading municipal planning documents that nobody had sent him and nobody expected him to find, understanding what they meant, choosing silence because silence was the strategy that protected what he intended to leave behind. She thought about herself, 6 years above a dry cleaner's, 3 sets of accounts kept with meticulous care, a small balcony garden, Sunday phone calls, showed the patient ordinary life of a person who pays attention and keeps promises and does not need to be seen doing either. 3 generations of people who understood that the difference between something and nothing was mostly a matter of whether you were paying close enough attention. She said, "Thank you, Diana." Diana said, "Don't thank me yet. Wait until we have a final number." They parted on the steps, and Rosalind walked to her car and drove to the restaurant on 5th, where she was already 10 minutes late for the weekly accounts review, and she spent 2 hours going through the numbers with the same focused care she always brought to them, and she found the thing that needed finding, as she always did, and she noted it and resolved it and left the file in better order than she had found it. The call from Marcus came 8 days before the follow-up meeting with the state. He had been doing research, he said. More than research. He had been talking to people, plural, people who understood land acquisition and transit corridor valuation, and what the specific position of a specific parcel in relation to a specific project implied in terms of numbers. He had been doing what Marcus always did when he discovered he had been operating on incomplete information, which was to acquire the missing information as rapidly and thoroughly as possible, and then present the resulting picture as though it had always been his intention to have it. The number he named when he said Rosalind, "What exactly is the acquisition value we're talking about here?" was almost exactly the number Diana Crane had given her months ago. Or she said it was still being negotiated. He said, "That's an extraordinary amount of money, Rosalind." She said, "Yes." He said, "For 14 acres that nobody knew was worth anything." She said, "Dad knew." There was a silence. She had never heard quite that quality of silence from Marcus before. The specific texture of a person confronting something they should have seen and did not. He said, "The deed box." "Yes." He said, "When he left you the deed box at the reading, I thought. We both thought." "I know what you thought," she said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was clear. The voice of someone who has been sitting with the truth long enough that they do not need to protect anyone from it anymore. He said, "He planned this. He knew what that land was going to be worth." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Why didn't he just tell us? So tell all of us?" She thought about how to answer that. She thought about what her father had written in the 3 careful pages, about the manner of things and the only approach that would work, and the particular quality of attention that he had relied on in choosing her. She thought about the leather portfolio and the cream blazer and the renovation notebook and the comment about the carriage house offered for sentiment's sake. She said, "Because he knew who would do something with it and who would not. He knew who was paying attention. The silence this time was different. Longer." Marcus said, "That's a hard thing to hear." She said, "I know." She meant it. She was not trying to wound him. The wound was already there, put there not by her or by their father, but by decades of assumption. The assumption that the obvious things were the important things. The assumption that what did not announce itself did not matter. He said, "What are you going to do with it?" She said, "I'm going to handle it carefully." "The same way I handle everything," he said, "Rosalind." "Is there—" He stopped and started again. "Is there any possibility of a family conversation about this?" She said, "Of course. There's always room for conversation." But she kept her voice steady and clear and said, "The land is mine, Marcus. The deed is clean. Diana has confirmed that, and the county records confirm it. I want to be fair to you, and I want to be honest with you, but the land is mine." He said he understood. She was not certain he did. Not yet. Not fully. Understanding of that kind usually required more time than a single phone call. But he said it, and she accepted it, and they agreed to talk again the following week. And she hung up and sat at her desk for a moment, looking at the wall. She did not feel victorious. That was the thing she noticed most, the absence of what she might have expected to feel. She did not feel the sharp, particular pleasure of being right when someone else was wrong. She felt something quieter and more complex than that. She felt the weight of what her father had done, and the length of time he had spent doing it, and the trust it represented, the specific trust of a man who had looked at his daughter's quiet, careful life, and seen in it not diminishment, but capacity. She felt the responsibility of being the person who had been chosen. She went back to work. 2 weeks later, the follow-up meeting with the state produced a revised figure, though Howard presented it with the manner of someone who has made a significant concession and wants credit for making it gracefully, which was fair. It was a significant concession. Patricia had reviewed Diana's methodology and found it, as Diana had predicted, sound. The state's revised number was substantially higher than their opening position. It was not yet Diana's number, but the distance between them had narrowed considerably. Diana said, "We appreciate the movement. We're not there yet," Howard said. "What would get us there?" Diana said, "A number that reflects the parcel's value to the project, rather than the parcel's value in the absence of the project. Those are two different calculations, and we should be working from the second one." Patricia wrote something on her notepad. Howard looked at the table for a moment. Then he named a third figure, higher than the second. Diana looked at Rosalind. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about the row of old maples along the western edge of the field, planted in a line too regular to be accidental, by a farmer who had been gone for 100 years and had not known he was planting them along the boundary of something that would one day matter in ways he could not have imagined. She was thinking about her grandfather, standing at that wire fence in 1947. She was thinking about the stone wall going back to the earth, patient and uncomplaining, doing nothing but being there. She said to Diana quietly, "What do you think?" Diana said, "I think we counter once more." They countered. Howard stepped out of the room for 12 minutes. When he came back, he had a number that was, if not precisely Diana's number, close enough that the distance between them was smaller than the cost of continued negotiation. Diana looked at the number. Then she looked at Rosalind, with a question in her expression that required no words. Rosalind looked at the number written on the notepad Patricia had turned toward them across the table. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you have been working toward for a long time, not with surprise because you have been preparing for it, but with the specific weight of a thing finally becoming real after existing for months, only as a possibility. She said, "Yes." Howard extended his hand. Rosalind shook it. Patricia began gathering documents with the efficient movement of someone transitioning from negotiation to execution. Outside on the steps again, the April afternoon considerably warmer than the March morning when they had first climbed them, Diana said, "Congratulations." Rosalind said, "Thank you. For everything." Diana allowed herself a brief and precise smile. "Your father did the real work," she said. "We just carried it forward." Rosalind looked at the street, at the city in its ordinary afternoon motion. She thought about calling Marcus. She thought about calling Julian. She decided to wait one more day, to sit with it herself first, to let it be real to her before she made it real to anyone else. She had earned the right to that one day. She drove home, parked the Subaru in its usual spot, and went upstairs. She made tea and stood on the balcony looking at the spring planting, the things that had been small and tentative a month ago, now showing genuine intention. I am reaching toward the light in the particular way of living things that have gotten enough of what they need to commit to growing. She had gotten enough of what she needed. She was ready to grow. She called Marcus the following morning, a Saturday, when she knew he would have time and would not be able to claim the excuse of a meeting or a conference call. He answered on the third ring with the careful tone of someone who has been expecting this call and has been preparing for it. She told him the acquisition was complete. She told him the final number. She told him calmly and without drama, the way you tell someone a fact that is now fixed and real, and no longer subject to the uncertainty that makes things difficult to say. The silence on his end lasted longer than any silence she had heard from him in the years of knowing him. He said, "For Rosalind." She said, "I know." He said, "Dad really knew." She said, "He really knew." He said, "And he knew you'd—" He stopped. "He knew you would handle it." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to be honest with you. When the attorney read the will and said the deed box, I thought it was symbolic, something for sentiment." He paused. He stopped again. "I should have looked more carefully," she said. "Yes, you should have." But she said it without anger, and that was true. It was genuine. The absence of anger was not a performance, but the actual condition of what she felt, which was something more like sorrow for the habit of assumption, for the years of looking at her quiet, careful life and seeing smallness rather than depth. She said, "Marcus, I want to be fair. The same way Dad was fair, in his own way, in the way that he could be. I have what I have. It's mine, and it's real, and it changes things significantly. But I am not interested in a family war about it. I am interested in being the person he believed I was." Marcus said, "He believed you were someone who would do the right thing." She said, "He believed I would do the careful thing, which usually is the right thing." He laughed, a short and real sound, surprised out of him. "That sounds like him," he said. "It does," she agreed. They talked for another 20 minutes, the longest conversation she had had with her brother in years that wasn't about logistics or coordination or the management of the family's practical business. When they hung up, she stood by the window for a while, looking out at the street, thinking about her father and his steady, unhurried approach to everything. The way he moved through the world, as though he understood that most of what mattered was invisible to people going too fast to look. She understood that now. She had always understood it. It was the thing they had always shared, father and daughter, and it turned out to be worth more than the mansion, more than the lake house, more than everything that had been divided up at a dining room table on an October morning, while the green velvet curtains held back the light, and a careful man's careful work waited in a box on a shelf for the person he had trusted to open it. She went to the balcony and stood among her spring plants and let the afternoon sun find her face, and did not think about anything in particular for a little while. The balcony was small. The car was 12 years old. The table was secondhand. None of that was going to be a problem anymore. Julian called the same afternoon that Marcus did. She had been expecting that too, though Julian's call was harder to anticipate in its specifics because Julian was a different kind of person than Marcus, more guarded about what he admitted, more practiced at the kind of confidence that does not allow itself to be shaken visibly. Marcus had gone quiet on the phone, and you could hear the quiet working, the recalibration happening in real time. Julian's silences were more controlled than that, more strategic, and so when he called, she did not know exactly what version of Julian she would be speaking with. He was warmer than she expected. He said he had talked to Marcus, that Marcus had told him the number, that he was genuinely happy for her, and she listened to all of that and recognized the truth underneath it, even if the delivery was smoother than it needed to be. He was genuinely happy for her, in the complicated way that people are genuinely happy for someone close to them, when the happiness requires them to also acknowledge something uncomfortable about themselves. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You don't need to." He said, "No, I do." At the reading, when Fitch read the will and got to your portion, I said something about the carriage house, about sentiment. She remembered, for sentiment's sake, something tangible. She said, "I know what you said." He said, "It was condescending, and it was wrong." She let that sit for a moment, gave it the space it had earned. Then she said, "You didn't know what was in the box," he said. "No, but I assumed it wasn't important, and I assumed it out loud in front of you. And that was," he paused, "that was not how I should have been." She said, "I appreciate you saying that." And she meant it. The apology was real enough. The insight behind it was real enough. People were who they were. They saw what their habits of attention allowed them to see, and sometimes those habits had to be broken by something large and unavoidable before they changed. Julian had not been malicious at the table that October morning. He had been operating on assumptions he had never had reason to examine. The examination was happening now. That was something. She said, "Julian, I want you to know that this doesn't change things between us in the ways that would make it worse. The land was always mine. Dad made that choice. It's done. But you're still my brother, and I don't want this to become a thing that sits between us for years." He said, "I don't want that either." She said, "Good. Then it won't be." They talked for a while after that, cautiously at first, and then with more ease, the ease of siblings, who are remembering that they know each other outside of the context of an estate, who have a history that is longer and more complicated than a reading of a will. He asked about her work. She asked about his daughter, who was 13, and apparently in the midst of deciding that her parents were not people she needed to spend time with, which was age-appropriate and universally difficult. He laughed when she said that. She laughed too. When they hung up, she felt lighter than she had expected to feel. The following week, Diana called to tell her the acquisition paperwork was proceeding through the state's processes with the expected efficiency, that the timeline for closing was approximately 6 to 8 weeks, and that Rosalind should begin thinking practically about what came next. Not urgently, Diana said, but thoughtfully. There were questions of tax planning and financial management, and the practical business of receiving a sum of that size that benefited from careful consideration before the money arrived, rather than after. She had recommendations for advisors, people she trusted, people who would not see the situation as an opportunity. Rosalind said she would be ready. She had always been ready for the careful version of things. She spent the following weeks continuing to do exactly what she had always done, and because the work still needed doing, regardless of what was happening in the background of her life, and because the discipline of ordinary work was one of the things that kept her from becoming someone she did not recognize. She balanced the restaurant's books. She reconciled the importer's accounts. She managed the accounting firm's internal records with the thoroughness that had made them loyal clients for 3 years. She also began, quietly and without announcement, to think about what she wanted the next chapter of her life to look like. Not in the way of people who have just won the lottery and immediately imagine themselves in foreign cities or on yachts. In the way of a person who has spent years building a small and careful life and now has the opportunity to build something less constrained by necessity, but shaped by the same values that had always guided her: precision and patience, and the willingness to pay attention to things other people walked past. She thought about her father's garden, the one behind the mansion that had gone half wild in his final years, the formal beds losing their edges to time and inattention. She thought about what it had looked like when she was young, when her mother was alive, and tended it with the same steady hands that braided Rosalind's hair, when it was something ordered and alive and deliberately beautiful. She thought about the 14 acres with the old maples and the stone wall and the depression in the center that collected water. That land would be transferred to the state. That was the transaction. That was what the acquisition meant. And she had made peace with it, because the land's value had never been in what it looked like, but in what it represented: the patience of her grandfather, the foresight of her father, the long, quiet chain of careful attention that had brought it to this moment. She thought about what she wanted to build in the next chapter. She was not in a hurry. She had time now, and she intended to use it the way she used everything: carefully. The paperwork closed on a Tuesday in May, 6 weeks after the final meeting in the state office building. Diana called at 11 in the morning to confirm that everything had processed, that the transfer was complete, that the funds would be in the account Diana had helped her establish with the advisors by end of business. She said it with the same precise economy she brought to everything: the facts delivered without inflation, the news treated as news rather than drama. Rosalind said, "Thank you, Diana." "For all of it?" Diana said, "It was good work. Your father set it up well. You carried it through. That's the whole story." She supposed it was. She went out for lunch alone, to a small place near her apartment that she had been going to for years, where the owner knew her order and had it started when he saw her come through the door. She sat at her usual table by the window and ate her lunch and looked out at the street and thought about her father. She thought about him at his desk in the study, the deed box on the shelf, the key on the key ring, the municipal documents he had found and read with the same methodical attention he brought to everything he considered worth understanding. She thought about the phone calls, every Sunday evening without fail, and the pauses at the end that she had not understood until she read his letter. She thought about a man who had known he was running out of time and had spent some of that time making sure the right thing would end up in the right hands. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, not randomly, not by default, but deliberately, by someone who had watched her for a long time and understood what they saw. It meant something. It meant she had a responsibility to be the person he had believed she was. She finished her lunch and left a larger tip than usual and walked home in the May sunshine, which was the specific, warm and gentle sunshine of a city in the first real days of spring warmth, the kind of afternoon that makes people walk slower than they need to because the weather has made slowness feel like the right pace. She called Marcus from the balcony when she got home. He picked up immediately. She told him the transfer had closed. He said, "Rosalind." Just that, her name, with a quality in his voice that was not quite any single thing, but was made of several things at once: acknowledgement and something that was close to awe and something that was close to a complicated form of respect. She said, "I've been thinking." He said, "About what?" She said, "About the garden behind the mansion. Before you finalize the sale, I'd like to see if we can negotiate something. Just the garden plot, a small portion of the property." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why?" She said, "Because Mom planted it." He was quiet for longer this time. He said, "I'll talk to Julian," she said. "Thank you." She stood on the balcony after she hung up, her hands wrapped around her empty mug, looking at the spring planting. The things she had put in the ground on a warm afternoon in March were fully themselves now, established and green, and going about their patient business of growing in the particular unhurried way of living things that know they have what they need. She was going to have a garden, not a balcony, a real one, with soil and space and room for the things her mother used to grow: the peonies and the old roses and the lavender that had been at the edge of every summer of her childhood. The particular scent of it carried on warm afternoon air through open windows. And she was going to have time and space and the resources to be careful in ways that poverty of various kinds had not always allowed. She was going to do it the way her grandfather had done everything, the way her father had done everything, the way she had always done everything, with patience, with attention, without announcing it. She went inside and opened her laptop and began drafting the account summary for the dry goods importer that was due at the end of the week, because the work still needed doing, and she was still the person who did it. And that was not going to change. Not really. Because who you were did not change when the circumstances changed, or it shouldn't, and she intended to make sure it didn't. She found the discrepancy she had been tracking for 2 weeks, the one that had been hiding in a rounding error in the quarterly totals, small and patient and persistent, waiting for the right quality of attention to find it. She found it. She fixed it. She sent the corrected file with a brief note explaining what had happened. Then she closed the laptop and made dinner and sat at the second-hand table and ate it. And after dinner, she washed the dishes and stood at the kitchen window for a little while, looking at nothing in particular. The table was second-hand, but the table was hers. Everything she had was hers. Not because it was given to her, not exactly, but because she was the kind of person who knew what to do with what she was given. That was the inheritance. Not 14 acres. Not a number in a bank account. Not a deed in a box. The inheritance was the capacity to see what mattered, and to hold it carefully, to be patient with it, to carry it forward. Her grandfather had had it. Her father had had it. She had had it all along. She just hadn't had the occasion to show anyone yet. The night the money arrived, she did not celebrate. She had thought she might, had half expected some impulse toward ceremony when the confirmation appeared in her account. The number sitting there in the balance column with the patient factual presence of a thing that has stopped being a possibility and become a condition of reality. She had imagined, not precisely but in outline, that she might feel something sharp and definitive at that moment, the emotional equivalent of a door swinging open. Instead, she felt something quieter. She sat with the confirmation on her phone for a long time, in the kitchen, at the second-hand table, in the light from the fixture overhead that she had been meaning to replace with something warmer for 3 years. She sat with it, and let it be real, and let the reality of it settle into her the way that large and genuine things settle, not all at once, but gradually, the way water finds its level. She thought about the morning of the will reading, the October light at the gap in the green velvet curtains, her hands folded in her lap. She thought about the drive home with the deed box buckled into the back seat of the Subaru. She thought about 2 in the morning at the kitchen table, with the 3rd cup of tea, cooling beside the documents spread under the kitchen light. She thought about standing at the edge of the field in March, the cold air against her face, the old maples in their patient row, the stone wall going quietly back to the earth. She thought about her father. She thought about what he had understood about her over the years of Sunday evenings and cups of coffee and the ordinary sustained contact of a parent and a child who had remained close in the particular way of people who are similar in the ways that matter most. He had understood that she was reliable. He had understood that she was careful. He had understood that she was the kind of person who found the thing that needed finding and fixed it and sent it along without requiring acknowledgement. He had understood that she was patient in the way that patience is actually a form of strength rather than a form of waiting, the willingness to hold something important for as long as it takes for the right moment to arrive. He had trusted her with his most careful act. She intended to be worthy of it. She put the phone down and sat for another few minutes in the kitchen light, and then she got up and washed the coffee cup she had left in the sink from the morning and put it in the drying rack and went to bed. The world would still be there in the morning. It would just be a slightly different world than the one she had woken up in. She was ready for that. She had been ready for a long time. She thought, in those quiet weeks between the closing and the beginning of whatever came next, about the nature of what her father had done. Not the practicalities of it. Those were clear enough. The documents, and the deed, and the key on the keyring, and the 3 pages written in the slightly unsteady hand of a man who knew he was running out of time. She had understood the practicalities from the first week. What she thought about now was the decision underneath the practicalities, the decision about who and the decision about why. The specific understanding her father must have reached about his 3 children and their different relationships to the world. Marcus was not a bad man. She had always known that, and the calls after the announcement had confirmed it. The willingness to acknowledge what he had assumed and what the assumption had cost him. He was a man who had been given every reason to believe that the obvious things were the important things, that what announced itself loudly was what mattered, that the measure of value was whatever other people with good judgment had already agreed to measure. He had gone through his whole life in that belief, and it had served him well in most respects, and had only failed him in this specific one, the one that required looking at a quiet woman with a small apartment and a 12-year-old car, and understanding that the quality of her attention was worth more than anything that could be immediately priced. Julian was not a bad man either. The apology had been real, and the insight behind it, even if delivered in Julian's smoother and more controlled way, had been genuine. He was a man who had learned early that confidence was a kind of currency, and had spent his life spending it, and the spending had cost him the habit of looking carefully at things that didn't seem to need his confidence applied to them. Their father had seen all of this. He had watched his 3 children grow into adults and had understood, with the clear-eyed assessment of a man who paid attention to people the way some men paid attention to land, who each of them was and what each of them was suited for. He had loved all 3 of them. The deed box was not a punishment for Marcus and Julian. It was a recognition of Rosalind, which was a different thing entirely, and she had come to understand that distinction clearly. She sat with that understanding for a while and found that it didn't make her feel triumphant. It made her feel the weight of what had been trusted to her, the specific gravity of being seen accurately by someone whose seeing had always mattered. She intended to carry that weight well. She intended to build something with what she had been given that her father would have recognized, and something careful and patient and quietly extraordinary in the way of things that do not announce themselves. She was already thinking about it. She was, as she had always been, paying attention. There was one more thing she needed to do before she could fully close the chapter on the acquisition and open the next one. She drove back to the field. It was a Saturday morning in late May, warm and clear, the kind of morning that makes the countryside look deliberate in its beauty. Everything green and specific and lit from an angle that makes familiar things look newly considered. She drove the same route she had driven in March, when the sky was pewter and the GPS had confused her, and the field had been matted and pale with last year's hay still lying in its winter windrows. She parked in the same gravel turnout and got out of the car. The field had changed, not dramatically, not in the way of things that transform overnight, but in the slow and genuine way of things responding to the season. The lower depression in the center was ringed with the first green of grasses and low plants that liked wet ground, and the tree line at the far edge was fully leafed now, a full and living green that had replaced the complicated gray pattern of bare branches she had seen in March. The old maples along the western boundary were in complete leaf, their canopy established and dense, doing the patient work of trees that have been doing that work for a century and intend to continue. She climbed the fence this time. She walked out into the field, into the hay that was growing back now, knee-high in places, soft against her boots. She walked to the stone wall and stood beside it, running her hand along the topmost stones, the ones that had held their position despite the decades of the wall around them, settling and shifting. The stones were warm from the morning sun. They had been here longer than she had been alive, longer than her father had been alive, put here by someone whose name she did not know and could not find. She walked to the center of the field, to the low depression, and stood there. She was standing in the middle of what had funded the next chapter of her life. It didn't look like much. It looked like a field. It looked like the kind of thing you could drive past 1,000 times and never think twice about. She stood there for a while in the May sun, with the grass moving around her in the light wind, somewhat, and she thought about her grandfather and her father, and the long chain of patient attention that had led to this moment. And she felt grateful in the way you feel grateful, when gratitude is not a performance, but an actual condition, something that has settled into your bones rather than sitting on the surface. She said, out loud to nobody and to everyone at once, "Thank you, Dad." The field did not answer. The wind moved through the grass. The old maples along the western edge stood in their patient row. She walked back to the car. She had work to do. She always had work to do. And she was, at last, exactly where she needed to be. The first thing she did with the money was nothing. Not nothing in the way of paralysis or indecision, not the frozen stillness of someone who has received something so large they cannot find the edges of it. For it was a deliberate nothing, a chosen pause, the same kind of pause she had always used when a set of accounts presented a discrepancy she did not yet fully understand. The discipline of waiting until you know what you are looking at before you move. She had learned over years of careful work that the instinct to act quickly on new information was one of the most reliable ways to make errors that took 3 times as long to fix as they would have taken to avoid. She did not act quickly on new information. She sat with it. She let it become familiar. She let it stop feeling like an emergency. So she waited 3 weeks after the transfer closed before she had the first real conversation with the financial advisors Diana had recommended. She spent those 3 weeks living exactly as she had lived before. The same apartment, the same car, the same 3 sets of accounts balanced with the same meticulous care, the same balcony garden tended with the same attention. She made no large purchases. She told almost nobody. She sat with the new reality of her financial life and let it settle into her understanding the way a landscape settles after rain, everything in its right place, but the ground subtly changed beneath your feet. The advisors were a husband and wife team who worked out of an office that was deliberately understated. No marble lobby, no artwork chosen to communicate wealth, just a clean and organized workspace that communicated competence and the serious use of time. Their names were Robert and Helen Chen, and Diana had described them as people who would not see her situation as an opportunity, which was exactly what she needed, and which was rarer than it should have been. Robert was precise and methodical, and asked questions that were exactly as specific as they needed to be, and no more general than necessary. Helen was warmer, and had the gift of translating the technical into the human, without losing the accuracy of either. They spent the first meeting simply listening. Rosalind had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, which was thoroughly, bringing her own notes and her own questions organized in the order that made logical sense rather than emotional sense. She told them where she was and where she thought she wanted to go, not in the language of grand ambition, but in the specific practical terms of a person who had been careful for a long time and intended to continue being careful, just with more room to work in. Robert said, "What do you want the money to do?" She said, "I want it to last. I want it to be useful. I want it to give me the freedom to do the work I want to do rather than only the work I need to do." Helen said, "And what work do you want to do?" Rosalind thought for a moment. She said, "The same work I've always done, but with more space around it." They liked that answer. She could tell by the quality of their attention, the slight settling of the room, that happens when people who are good at what they do encounter a client who understands what they actually need, rather than what they imagine they want. They talked for 2 hours that first meeting, and she left with a plan that was not yet final, but had the shape of something she recognized, something patient and considered and built to last, are the financial equivalent of old maples planted in a row. The garden negotiation with Marcus took longer than the acquisition negotiation had taken with the state, which she found both amusing and instructive. The state had been motivated by a timeline. Marcus was motivated by sentiment, which is a less predictable force and responds poorly to the kind of logical argument that works well with project directors and acquisition coordinators. He was not unwilling. That had been clear from the first conversation. But he needed to reach willingness through his own understanding rather than being directed to it, which was a distinction she had learned to respect, even when it made things slower. She was patient. She had time now. Julian was easier, as she had expected. So Julian's manner of processing things was to reach a position quickly once he had the key information, and then hold to it with the same confidence he applied to everything. Once he understood what she was asking for and why, which took one phone call of about 20 minutes, he was in favor, and he stayed in favor without wavering. He called Marcus and added his weight to her request, which was perhaps more useful than she would have been able to accomplish on her own, the two brothers having long practiced the particular efficiency of agreeing on something once Julian stopped arguing against it. What she wanted was a portion of the property, specifically the garden behind the mansion and the small strip of land it occupied, to be carved out of the sale as a separate parcel that she would purchase at a fair price before the mansion went to market. She was not asking for it as a gift. She was not invoking her father or her mother or the history of the place in a way that would have felt manipulative. She was making a straightforward business proposal, a separate transaction, a fair price, a clean boundary. She had already had the parcel surveyed and described. She had already consulted a local attorney about the mechanics of the subdivision. She arrived at the conversation with Marcus, having done the work that most people expected to do after the conversation, rather than before it, which was the part of her that her father had named when he wrote the letter. The part that paid attention, that did the preparation, and that understood that the real work was usually done in the time before the moment that appeared to be the moment. Marcus agreed. She bought the garden, not the mansion, not the 11 rooms and the original floors and the carriage house. Those went to market in June and sold in August to a couple from the city who had been looking for exactly that kind of property in exactly that neighborhood, and who paid a price that made Marcus and Julian very pleased with the timing of their decision to list. She attended none of the viewings and none of the negotiations. The mansion was their inheritance, and she had no claim on it, and no interest in complicating their management of it. She had what she had come for, the garden, her mother's garden. She had it surveyed and fenced, and she hired a landscaper for the initial clearing work, on someone who understood the difference between wild and overgrown and dead, who could look at a bed that had been abandoned for 3 years and see what was underneath the chaos rather than simply what was on top of it. The peonies were still there, the roots too deep and too determined to be driven out by a few years of neglect. The old roses along the south wall had done what old roses do when left alone, which was to grow vigorously in all directions simultaneously and make enthusiastic tangles of themselves. But the canes were healthy, and the rootstock was sound, and with proper cutting back, they would be perfectly fine. The lavender at the east edge had seeded itself in several new directions and had to be largely rethought. But lavender was forgiving, and the soil there was well drained, and the afternoon light was good. She spent a Saturday in June on her knees in the garden with the landscaper and a pair of good gloves and the specific physical pleasure of work that produces immediate visible results. The dirt under her fingernails, the pulled muscles in her lower back at the end of the afternoon, the rows of cleared bed that revealed the good dark soil underneath. She had forgotten this, the particular satisfaction of working with the ground, the way it made everything that wasn't the work fall away for hours at a time. Her mother had known this. Her mother had come out here on Saturday mornings the same way, in the same good light, and worked until the light changed, and then come inside smelling of earth and cut stems and whatever was blooming at the edges of the beds. Rosalind worked until the light changed. She came inside smelling of earth. She sat on the steps of the small structure she had arranged to have built at the garden's edge, a simple one-room building that was not quite a shed and not quite a studio, but was something in between, with enough light and enough space for a desk and a chair and a small table, and whatever she decided she needed it to be. She had not yet decided. She was leaving that open on purpose, in the way her father had always left certain things open until they showed her what they wanted to become. She sat on the steps with a cup of tea and looked at the garden in the late afternoon light, the cleared beds and the rose canes and the peonies showing the first tentative evidence of next year's ambition, the small green points of growth already forming at the base of the stalks, even though it was only June, even though there were months yet before the ground would be ready to support them. Her grandfather had been like this, patient in advance of necessity. Her father had been like this. She was like this. She drank her tea and let the evening come in around her. In September, she made 2 decisions that she had been thinking about since the spring. The first was to reduce her bookkeeping practice rather than close it. She had thought at first that the practical necessity of the work was the primary thing that kept her doing it, that financial freedom would allow her to stop. And she had been surprised to discover on reflection that she did not want to stop. Not entirely. Not in the clean, decisive way she had imagined she might. She wanted to keep working with the restaurant on 5th, where she had been for 4 years, and where the owner was a person she respected, and whose books genuinely interested her in the way that small business is built by people with a clear vision of what they want to make tend to interest her. She let the other 2 clients go, gently and with enough notice to ensure they found good replacements, and she kept the restaurant. And she found that working 10 hours a week on something she chose felt entirely different from working 40 hours a week on everything she could find. She had not expected that distinction to feel as significant as it did. The second decision was to start something she had been circling for years without landing, a project that had lived in the back of her mind as an idea that had no practical home until now. She was going to write about her grandfather. Not his whole life. She was not equipped for that, and it was not what interested her. What interested her was the particular shape of the decision he had made in 1947, the decision to buy 14 unremarkable acres in a county that was still becoming what it would be, to look at a piece of ground that offered no immediate evidence of its own value, and to understand something about the future that the present had not yet caught up to. She was interested in that quality of attention, in where it came from, and what it looked like, and how it got passed from one generation to the next, in the specific and uncelebrated way that qualities of mind travel through families, not through teaching exactly, but through proximity and observation, and the slow absorption of watching someone you love pay attention to the world in a particular way. She began by going through the family papers more carefully than she had gone through the deed box, spending weekends at the garden studio with the boxes her father had left in careful storage, reading her grandfather's letters and his account books, and the notes he had kept in a series of small green notebooks over the decades of his working life. His handwriting was clear and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who expected what he wrote to be read later, who understood that records were a form of conversation with the future. She spent hours with those notebooks. She began to understand her grandfather as a person, rather than simply as the origin point of something, and the understanding was more complicated and more interesting and more human than the useful simplified version of him she had been carrying around for years. He had made mistakes. He had been wrong about things. He had held assumptions that the later decades had corrected. But underneath all of it was the quality she was looking for, the thing she had felt standing in the field in March and in May, the willingness to look at the present moment with enough detachment to see it from the future's perspective, to ask not what this is worth now, but what it will be worth when the world catches up to it. She wrote about this. She was not certain yet what form it would take, a family history, an essay, something less defined than either. She wrote in the mornings in the garden studio with the September light coming through the east windows and the sound of the garden around her, a sound that was becoming familiar, the way all sounds become familiar with enough time. And she wrote slowly and without a deadline, which was a form of freedom she was still learning to accept, the freedom of a person who does not have to produce on any schedule but their own. It was harder than working under necessity. It was also more fully hers. Marcus called in October. It was a year, nearly to the day, since the will reading. She noted this without mentioning it when she answered the phone. His voice was different than it had been in the calls immediately following the acquisition. The defensive register was gone, and what remained was something more like the brother she had known before. The estate had made them all, briefly, into different versions of themselves. He said he wanted to see the garden. She said, "Of course." "Come whenever you want," he said. "Julian wants to come too." She said, "Good." They came on a Saturday in mid-October, both of them, which was not something that happened often enough that she had stopped being a little surprised by it. Julian's daughter came too, the 13-year-old who had recently decided her parents were people she could tolerate after all. A reversal that Julian described with the specific relief of a father who had not been sure it was coming. Her name was Petra, and she was quiet in the particular way of young people who are deciding whether the adults around them are worth their attention. Rosalind showed them the garden. The peonies were finished for the year, cut back now to their winter form, but the roses were still doing something in the October warmth, the last few blooms open in the pale gold light of autumn. The lavender was spending itself, the last of the season's color fading to the gray-green that would hold through winter. The beds were clean and mulched, the paths cleared, the whole space showing the evidence of a summer of careful work. Order restored under the overgrowth, the bones of her mother's design visible again under the patient attention of a daughter who had inherited the tendency to look carefully at things other people walked past. Marcus stood at the edge of the rose wall for a long time without saying anything. She let him stand there. She understood that he was seeing something she could not see from where she stood, some version of the past that was specifically his, different from hers, and real in a way she did not need to intrude on. She went to the studio and put the kettle on, and came back with tea for everyone. And by the time she returned, he had moved away from the roses and was standing in the center of the garden, looking up at the light coming through the old oak that had survived at the corner, the oak her father had planted the year Marcus was born. Julian said, "You did all this?" She said, "I had help." "But yes." He looked around slowly. "It looks like it used to. When Mom was alive," she said. "That was the idea." Petra had found the stone bench at the back of the garden, a piece she had not remembered being there until the landscaper uncovered it from under years of accumulated growth, and was sitting on it with her phone in her pocket for once, looking at the garden with the open-faced attention of someone seeing a place for the first time and finding it worth looking at. They drank their tea in the garden in the October light, sank the four of them, and they talked in the easy way of people who have gotten past something difficult and arrived on the other side of it, still themselves, but having moved through a thing together that changed the landscape slightly, made it familiar in a new way. Marcus said, "Dad would have liked this," she said. "I think he planned on it." Marcus looked at her. "You think he knew you'd buy the garden back?" she said. "I think he knew I'd find a way to take care of what mattered." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He knew you better than I did." She said, "He had different information. He was paying attention to different things." Julian said, "You're being generous," she said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." Marcus smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that had nothing in it but what it was. "You sound like him," he said, "when you say things like that." She said, "I know." She did know. She had always known that she was more like her father than either of her brothers was, in the specific ways that were hard to name, but easy to feel in the presence of another person who shared them. The quiet, the preference for precision over emphasis, the belief that the most important things were usually the things that did not announce themselves. She had sometimes thought of this as a limitation, the way quietness is sometimes thought of as a limitation, the assumption that what does not make itself visible does not matter. She understood now that her father had never thought of it as a limitation. He had thought of it as a capacity. He had been right. The afternoon grew cooler as October afternoons do, and they moved inside eventually, to the small studio, uncrowded and warm with 4 people in it, and Rosalind made more tea, and they sat on the mismatched chairs she had collected from various places, and talked for another hour about nothing particularly important. Petra's school, and Julian's work, and the apartment Marcus and Celeste were renovating in the city, and the restaurant whose books Rosalind still kept because she wanted to. When they left, Marcus paused at the garden gate and looked back. He said, "Thank you for keeping this." She said, "Thank you for letting me." He shook his head slightly. "There was nothing to let," he said. "It was always yours to keep. We just didn't know it yet." She said, "None of us did, at first." He nodded. So then he went through the gate, and she latched it behind him, and stood for a moment in the October garden, with the last light going warm and low across the rose wall, the oak tree casting its long shadow across the stone bench, where Petra had sat, with her phone in her pocket for an afternoon. Her father had planted that oak tree the year Marcus was born. She had never known that until she found it in one of the green notebooks, the entry matter-of-fact and brief. "Planted the oak today at the garden corner. Good soil there. Should do well." It had done well. It was 30 years old and thoroughly established, and would be there long after all of them were gone, doing the patient work of trees, which is simply to grow. She went inside the studio and sat at her desk, and opened the file where she had been writing about her grandfather. And she read back over the last few pages she had written, and then continued, picking up the sentence she had left unfinished that morning. She wrote about the quality of attention that sees the future in the present. She wrote about the way it travels through families, not as instruction, but as example. The accumulated slow effect of watching someone you love look at the world with a particular kind of care. She wrote about a man who had stood at the edge of a field in 1947 and seen something. She wrote about a man who had sat at a desk with a deed box on the shelf behind him and written 3 careful pages in slightly unsteady handwriting. She wrote about herself, standing at a wire fence in March with the cold against her face, looking at 14 acres that appeared to be nothing. She wrote about what it meant to be the person who understood what nothing actually contained, She wrote until the light in the studio was not enough to see by, and then she turned on the desk lamp and kept writing. The garden was quiet outside. The oak tree's shadow had gone. The roses held their last blooms in the October dark, patient and fragrant and indifferent to the cold that was coming, doing what roses do, which is to insist on beauty past the point where beauty seems reasonable, past the point where most things have given up and retreated into waiting for better conditions. She had always liked that about roses. She had always liked that about her mother, who had planted them. She wrote until she had said what she needed to say for that day, and then she saved the file and closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the lamplight with her hands in her lap, the way she had sat at the dining room table a year ago with the October light at the curtain gap, quiet and still and waiting for the right moment to understand what she was holding. She understood it now. Not only the financial inheritance, which was real and significant, and had changed the practical shape of her life in ways she was still learning to inhabit, but the other inheritance, the one that had been hers much longer, the one that was not documented in any deed box and could not be assessed by any county or acquired by any state project, or divided up at any table by any attorney with a measured voice and a document designed to be fair. The inheritance of attention, the inheritance of patience, the inheritance of the willingness to look carefully at a thing that does not announce itself and understand what it actually is. Her grandfather had had it. Her father had had it. It had come to her not because of any document or any decision, not because of the deed box or the letter or the survey map or the key on the key ring. It had come to her because she had grown up watching it and had absorbed it the way you absorb the things that surround you in your earliest years, before you know you are learning, before you know there is anything to learn, simply by being near people who showed you how to look. She had spent her whole life using it without knowing what to call it. She knew what to call it now. She turned off the desk lamp. She locked the studio and walked through the garden in the dark, the gravel of the path familiar under her feet, the smell of the last roses, and the turned earth of the beds she had worked all summer. Her mother's garden, and now her garden, continuous and repaired and growing. She got in the car. She drove home. The apartment above the dry cleaners was waiting. The same 6-year home, the same 2 rooms, the same balcony where the autumn planting was going in this weekend. She had not moved, had not needed to yet, had found that the urgency she had expected to feel about changing the visible conditions of her life had not arrived. The life she had built was a good life. The money had not revealed it to be small. The money had revealed it to be, in fact, exactly what she had always known it was: careful and real and sufficient and hers. She would move eventually. She had been looking at houses in the part of the county she liked, the older neighborhoods with the longer trees, places where things had been given enough time to become what they were. She was not in a hurry. She had learned from her grandfather and from her father, and from the 14 acres of patient ground, that the best things came to people who were willing to wait for the right conditions, who did not mistake the present assessment of a thing for the final one. She parked the car and went upstairs and made tea and stood on the balcony in the October dark, looking at the small things growing in their containers, the autumn plants she had put in the weekend before, on making themselves at home in the city soil she had mixed and prepared with the care of someone who understood that what you put in the ground is what you get back from it. She thought about her father's letter, the 3 careful pages in the slightly unsteady hand, the measured voice making its way through the most important thing he had written in a long time, maybe in his whole life. The sentence she had read 3 times before she could move past it. What appeared to be nothing was in fact everything. She had thought, when she first read it, that he was talking about the land. She understood now that he was talking about her. He was telling her what he saw when he looked at the quiet, careful life she had built, the apartment and the 3 sets of accounts, and the balcony garden and the Sunday phone calls. He was telling her that what appeared, to the casual eye, to be a small life was in fact a large one, measured in the currency that actually mattered, which was attention and patience and the willingness to do the careful work without needing it to be seen. He had seen it. He had spent years seeing it. And in the end, he had done what fathers do when they want to say something important to a child they love and trust. He had shown her, rather than told her, had arranged the conditions under which she would understand on her own, had handed her a box with a key, and trusted her to know what to do with what was inside. She had known. She had always known. She just hadn't had the occasion to show anyone yet. She drank her tea on the balcony in the October dark, and the city moved around her in its ordinary nighttime way. The lights and the traffic and the distant sounds of people going about their lives, and she felt something she recognized as contentment, the real kind, the kind that is not the absence of wanting more, but the presence of knowing that what you have is what you needed, that the life you have built is the life you were building toward all along without knowing it, that the careful work of decades has produced exactly what careful work produces, which is a foundation solid enough to build anything on. She went inside. She washed her cup. She went to bed. The alarm was set for 6 because she had an early morning with the restaurant accounts, and she liked to be there before the kitchen staff arrived, in the quiet before the day's work began, with the numbers and the records and the patient task of making sure everything was in order. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. Her father had known. In November, she found the 2nd notebook. She had been working her way through the boxes of her father's papers systematically, the way she worked through everything, one box at a time, reading in order, making notes, cross-referencing dates and names with the family timeline she had been building in a separate document. Most of what she found was the expected material of a long and organized life, correspondence filed by year, receipts and financial records maintained with the precision of a man who had always kept his own accounts, the accumulated correspondence of professional and personal relationships conducted over decades. The 2nd notebook was at the bottom of the 3rd box, wrapped in a piece of old flannel cloth, the kind of deliberate protection that signals intention. It was smaller than her grandfather's green notebooks, bound in brown leather, the pages filled with her father's handwriting from what appeared, based on the dates she found inside, to be the last 3 years of his life. She sat down on the floor of the studio with it. He had kept a record of everything he had found out about the land. Not a diary, not a personal journal in the emotional sense, but a working record in the manner of his father before him, facts and observations, and the careful tracking of information as he gathered it. She read the entries in order and watched the picture assemble itself across 3 years of patient research, the municipal planning documents he had found and what they described, the conversations he had conducted with a county planning official he had known for years, the further research he had done into transit infrastructure and how acquisitions were priced, and what the timeline looked like for a project of that scale. He had understood what he was looking at by the 2nd year. The 3rd year's entries were different in tone, less investigative and more considered, the record of a man who had already reached his conclusion and was now working out what to do with it. There were entries about each of his children, written with the careful fairness of someone who has thought deeply about what he owes the people he loves and what he is capable of giving each of them. He wrote about Marcus with genuine admiration for the things Marcus was good at, and with clear-eyed recognition of the things he was not. He wrote about Julian in the same way. He wrote about Rosalind last, and she had to set the notebook down after reading that section and look out the studio window at the November garden. Bare now, the beds put to sleep, the roses cut back, the oak tree stripped of its leaves and standing in its winter form, which was the form that showed its bones most clearly. He had written about her the way she had not known anyone thought about her. He had written about the Sunday calls, how much they meant to him, how she was the only one of his children who called consistently, week after week, who asked questions that showed she had been paying attention to the previous conversation, who remembered details and returned to them and followed the threads of his life with the genuine interest of someone who found the life interesting rather than simply performing filial attention. He had written about watching her manage the years after the divorce with a steadiness that he admired and that he recognized, because it was the same steadiness he had tried to model for his children by example, rather than instruction. The belief that difficulty was a condition to be managed rather than a signal that something had gone fundamentally wrong. He had written, in the plainest language he was capable of, that he was proud of her. Not proud of an achievement, not proud of something she had done that other people would notice and recognize. Proud of who she was, which was a different and more difficult thing to say, because it required seeing past what was visible to what was actually there, and he had been seeing it for years. And he had waited until these pages to say it in the particular way that permanence requires, written down, fixed, unable to be qualified or retracted or softened by time and imperfect memory. She sat on the floor of the studio with the brown leather notebook in her hands for a long time. The November garden was quiet outside. The oak tree stood in its bones. She had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to read something like that. Not the money, not the vindication, not the particular satisfaction of being the one who had been right about something. She had been waiting for this, for the evidence that he had seen her the way she had always hoped to be seen, for clearly and specifically, and with the full attention she had spent her life paying to everything she thought was worth understanding. He had seen her. He had always seen her. She put the notebook carefully back in its flannel wrapping and set it with the things she was keeping, separate from the things that would be filed or stored or passed on, the small collection of objects and papers that were hers in the most specific sense, the things that contained evidence of the people she had come from and what those people had understood. She went back to work. The winter moved through its months in the way winters do, with the particular insistence of a season that does not adjust to accommodate what you would prefer it to be. She worked on the writing project in the mornings and kept the restaurant's accounts on Tuesdays and spent her weekends reading and cooking and making the small repairs and improvements to the studio that became apparent as she spent more time there. She hired someone to plan the spring garden, a young woman named Adaze, who had studied landscape design and had the gift of looking at an established garden and understanding its history from the evidence, rather than needing to be told, who walked through the beds with Rosalind on a cold December afternoon and identified plants by their winter forms and spoke about what had been done here and what had been intended and what could be built on. It was the best conversation she had had in months. She had not expected to find that. The discovery that having resources allowed you not only to do the things you had always wanted to do, but to do them alongside people who were genuinely good at them, which produced something different from and better than either one of you would have produced alone. She thought about her father and his methodical search through the planning records, the way he had tracked down a county official he knew and asked careful questions, and then gone away and done more research on his own, building his understanding piece by piece with the patience of someone who has learned that the most important things cannot be rushed. He had not needed to do that work alone. He had chosen to, for reasons she understood now, the need for discretion, the importance of not revealing what he knew before the time was right. But the solitude of it had been a constraint, not a preference, and she thought he would have found a collaboration like this one, the landscape designer who saw what was there rather than what she expected to find, genuinely satisfying. She introduced a daze to the brown leather notebook. Not the private entries, not the pages about his children, but the entries about the garden, the records he had kept of what her mother planted and when, the notes on what had done well, in which beds, and what the soil conditions were in different parts of the space. Her father had kept those records with the same care he kept everything, and they were more useful to Adaise's planning than anything Rosalind could have described from memory. Adaise read them with the focused attention of someone in the presence of a primary source. She said, "He knew his garden." Rosalind said, "He knew everything he decided was worth knowing." Adaise looked at the notebook, and he decided this was worth knowing. "Yes," Rosalind said, "he did. Spring came back in the way it always did, insistently and ahead of schedule. The first warm days arriving in February, like an argument nobody had asked to have and nobody could refuse. She was in the garden on those first warm days, turning the soil in the beds that Adaise had planned over the winter, working with the specific physical pleasure she had rediscovered the previous summer, the satisfaction of work that produces visible results and leaves you with dirt under your fingernails and the good tiredness of muscles that have been used. The peonies came back. She had not been certain they would after the years of neglect, from after the clearing work that had been necessarily rough in places. But they came back with the determination of things that have deep roots and long memory, the red tips pushing through the February soil with the unhurried confidence of plants that have been in this ground for 30 years and intend to be here for 30 more. She stood over them and felt something she could not name precisely. Her mother had planted those peonies. Her mother had knelt in this same soil in some previous spring and put those roots in the ground with the same patient hands that had braided Rosalind's hair and called them in for dinner and worn the ordinary perfume on ordinary days, and had known, the way her mother had always known things, that what you put in the ground carefully enough will outlast you, will keep doing its work long after you are not there to tend it, will find its way back through neglect and through whatever winter throws at it, because roots like that do not give up. You did not have to be there to continue. You only had to have planted well enough in the first place. She understood this about her father's deed box now, in the specific physical way of a person standing over peony shoots in February soil, understanding it not as an idea, but as a condition of the world. He had planted well. She was the growing. She went to get her gloves. There was work to do, the best kind. The kind you choose, rather than the kind you endure. The kind that leaves the ground better than it found it. That puts something in the soil that will come back in a future you may or may not see. I am patient, and unhurried, and certain in the way of living things that have what they need. The garden was hers. The work was hers. The morning was hers. She had everything she needed. She had always had everything she needed. She just had more room for it now. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story. There was a moment in March, exactly 1 year after she had first stood at the wire fence, looking at the 14 acres, when she understood that she had completed something. Not finished, not closed. Those were the wrong words for the kind of thing that does not end so much as transform, that does not close so much as open into the next form of itself, but completed in the sense that a season completes itself, having done what it came to do, and ready now to become the next thing. She was in the garden on the March Saturday that fell closest to the anniversary, working in the beds when she became aware of it. Not through any dramatic revelation, not through a memory surfacing at the right moment, or a feeling arriving with the weight of significance. Just a quiet recognition, the way you recognize the turn of a tide, not by any single moment of change, but by the accumulated evidence of a direction that has been consistent all along. A year ago, she had stood at a fence and looked at a field. Now she was standing in a garden that was hers, in a life that had more room in it than the one she had lived the year before, with a writing project that was beginning to show the shape of what it wanted to become, and 3 generations of careful attention to the world sitting in her memory and in a brown leather notebook on the shelf in the studio, and the peonies already past their February tips and showing their first real leaves in the March soil, and the roses along the south wall beginning to bud, and the oak tree her father had planted the year Marcus was born, fully leafed again after the winter's stripping, doing the patient work that old trees do, which is simply to continue. She stopped working for a moment and stood in the garden with her gloves on and her hands at her sides and looked at what was growing. Her mother had planted the peonies. Her father had planted the oak. Her grandfather had planted the idea that some things were worth seeing before anyone else had seen them, worth waiting for, worth protecting in a deed box with a key on a key ring until the right person was ready to understand what they held. She had carried it forward. That was all inheritance ever was in the end. Not the transfer of things, but the continuation of a capacity, the handing forward of the ability to see and to wait and to build on what had been built before, to stand in a garden that someone else began, and understand that your job is not to possess it, but to tend it, to pass on what you received in better condition than you found it, to plant the things whose blooms you may not live to see, with the same confidence that they are worth planting. She bent back to the work. The soil was good. The morning was long. She had what she needed, and she was using it well, and the garden was growing, and the work was hers, and the life was hers, carefully and patiently, and with full attention, exactly the way her father had always known it would be. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you will really enjoy them. And do not forget to subscribe if you have not already. See you in the next story.